Just make sure everyone's muting if you're not speaking.
Okay, here we go, folks.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for dialing in today, and welcome to the Maximize Sneak Peek webinar, Comparability Data, Sources and Uses of Meaningful Comp Information. I'm Clark Everett, Director of Conference Education Programming at the National Apartment Association, and I'm your host for this afternoon. In less than 3 weeks, Maximize 2016 Multifamily Asset Management Conference convenes at the Lowe's Coronado Bay for its 3rd year. Maximize is the multifamily industry's sole event dedicated to net operating income, asset management, and long-term value creation. Attendees have told me that one of the greatest things about this event is the peer-to-peer interaction that takes place. Today you'll get a taste of that interaction as you hear our panelists discuss various industry data sources, what they provide, and how the data can be used in combination to help provide actionable insights into the properties in a portfolio. This afternoon, Maximize is bringing together distinguished industry professionals. Ian Mattingly is president of LumaCorp, a private multifamily investment and management firm based in Dallas. Rachel Davidson is vice president of revenue strategies at Alliance Residential, and she's responsible for the strategic direction of the company's revenue, sales, and ancillary services departments. And Justin Alanis is co-founder and CEO of Rentlytics, a business intelligence platform that harnesses the vast amount of data within a multifamily portfolio to help guide daily stakeholder decisions. And lastly, Nyla Westlake, vice president of asset management at Trammell Crow, has 20 years of experience working in multifamily in development, property, and asset management. In Nyla's role as managing director, she leads asset management for TCR nationally. Nyla isn't able to join the webinar today, but you can hear her side of the story when this panel convenes again in San Diego. I'm going to hand off the conversation now to our moderator, Justin Alanis. Good afternoon, Justin. How are you?
I'm doing well, Clark. Thank you very much for having us on today. Looking forward to this. Okay. Can you hear me, Clark?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Clark said, we have a great panel and a great session here coming up at the Maximize Conference in San Diego, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel. I used to use comp data extensively in my prior life as an asset manager, and before that running a property management group, doing acquisitions. And so I know how comp data is used through the different lenses of the portfolios that these folks who you'll hear on the panel today, and also Nyla, who will be with us in San Diego, how they use the data, the comp data throughout their portfolio as well. So through this session, we will be exploring the different types of comp data, as well as the different ways that these panelists use this comp data through their portfolio. It's very interesting because they provide, I think, very different perspectives, and that's one of the interesting things about this panel is the different perspectives that they all bring to the table. Rachel specifically brings to the table revenue-specific comp information from an asset management perspective, and I find that very interesting. So answering the question, how can you bring comp data into your existing portfolio and marry up that existing data with comp data to determine how you're doing compared to market trends and market information. Ian is bringing in also information as a smaller operator and getting creative with some of the comp data that he's using and looking at it a little bit more from an acquisition standpoint as well, and how you're using comp data to understand the acquisitions that you're looking at. And then Nyla is going to be bringing in, talking about how she brings in comp data from a development perspective, being with Trammell Crow Company. They do a lot of development, Class A development, and then looking at the comp data from that lens. So I find it very fascinating how we're going to be looking at the comp data from many different perspectives. Try to move to the next slide here. There we go. So today's the session objectives when we move into actual session in San Diego we're going to try to answer some of the questions that you see here. So and to set the framework a little bit and stepping back, one of the things that I'm really intrigued by is looking at all the different sources of comps that are out there, and that's actually one of the questions that we're going to be addressing specifically today on this webinar. But you have all these different comp providers that exist in the ecosystem, and one of the things that I'd like to get out of this session is how do you navigate all those different comp sources, which ones to buy, how to use them, which ones are good at certain aspects of different portfolios, acquisitions and development comp data, and you have all the regular players out there, Axio, Yardi Matrix, MPF, CoStar, Reese, and then there's also this aspect of identifying your own comps, using your property managers or your development associates or your asset managers to go out and explore their own comp information and determining which comps you want to go get. And then discussing the benefits and the drawbacks of the comp data from each one of these providers as well. So some of the drawbacks that I saw when I was on the asset management and property management side are that the comp data tends to be quarterly data. It's not necessarily immediate data. It also tends to be a small data size, sample size, and it's very tough to fit that data set into your existing workflow. So you have to pick and choose the metrics, and then identifying the comps within all the comp information that they give you is very, very tough. And so as we move through this, working through these challenges that this comp data presents, and will be something that the panelists discuss, and how they can overcome that, how they have overcome that, and how they've used this data to evaluate their portfolio with that lens is going to be very interesting. The other potential issue that's out there that I see all the time is that people mention is that a lot of this comp data represents asking rents instead of actual in-place effective rents, and so it doesn't accommodate for concessions. And also, a lot of it is survey data, right? And so, how do we overcome those challenges, those fundamental challenges associated with the comp data that's out there today? In addition to that, how can you asking questions about how you can ensure an apples comparison when looking at comp information, and so overcoming those challenges to now pick data that you want, selecting the right comps, and then making an apples-to-apples comparison. And then, what are the best sources? And then we talked about some of the concerns. And then, how can you use the comp data to evaluate current performance as well as forecast the future of the market? So those are some of the questions that we're going to be asking as we move through this session at Maximize in San Diego. Today, we're going to be focusing on one question in particular, or really two questions, I suppose, which is, why is comp data useful, and how do you define and identify true comps? So on that note, I would like to pass it off to Rachel Davidson, the Vice President of Revenue Strategies at Alliance Residential, who's going to be helping us dig into that specific question from her lens at Alliance Residential. So Rachel, thank you for joining us today, and I am happy to pass it over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Justin. So to kind of follow up a little bit on some of what both Clark and Justin shared in terms of an introduction to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to talk about today a little bit, is to kind of define, in my role as VP of Revenue Strategies at Alliance, one of my focuses is to facilitate kind of ownership investment objectives through training and guiding operations, meaning our site teams, to make the best possible decisions that lead to the best possible revenue growth. So in order to get our site teams there, we have to make sure that the message, both the philosophical piece and policy and process, gets to them. That philosophical piece is one big piece of it, because we've got to get them not just doing things the right way, but actually thinking about things in the right context as well, because it certainly helps to, to get them for it to resonate with them and so forth, and for them to kind of latch on to what it is that you're trying to ask them to do. And so I just want to clarify that today I'm kind of speaking from an operational point of view. Justin mentioned that there's several lenses that we look through in terms of evaluating comp data, and it can be a development strategy, it can be a sales and purchase strategy because you're purchasing a property or you're selling one. But in this case, using the market survey and comp data specifically, I'm speaking in context of operations and how we give our operations the best possible kind of arsenal, if you will, and thought process, and to be able to make effective decisions when it comes to sales and strategies and revenue tactics and marketing even. So with that said, how do we use comp data? So we all know that comp data not only gives us a measuring stick and benchmarks for performance, but more importantly, it reveals trends that are necessary when you're strategically planning. As much as our sites are individuals with their own individual kind of identities and characteristics, our sites are part of a greater network within our neighborhoods and submarkets. So these trends are really important for us to see and understand. So Alliance has worked not only to evaluate trending and performance data at the submarket level, but we actually use data to determine specific true comps at a true comp level that's much more granular than a submarket as well. We think that market data from a large sample size can be invaluable for finding kind of the box in which you should fit from a pricing standpoint, but developing a stronger, less generic pricing strategy requires a more granular look within a submarket. You know, that's how we feel about it. So some of those unique factors, both positive or negative about sites, should also be a focus when evaluating comp data. So kind of segueing away from that to the second part of the question is, who are our comps? Before using comp data for comparison or strategic planning purposes, kind of those uses that I discussed, we need to be clear who our comps are. And so there's a number of traditional questions we typically ask when evaluating comps. And those things are like age, proximity or location, could be amenity packages or finish levels. But before we even talk about those things, the questions that we ask first to identify who our comps are is, do you share traffic with that particular asset, and do you lose leases to them? Only when we can answer yes to both of those questions do we consider that a true comp for our assets. So there could be an asset directly across the street that is the same age, has a similar amenity package and a similar unit kind of makeup or unit mix. But if you're not sharing traffic, people aren't shopping between the two of you, and, not or, but and you lose leases to them somewhat frequently, they're not really a comp just because they're a lot like you. So that's kind of the perspective that we take when identifying who our true comps are. So once we've actually identified that short list of true comps, we then segue into more traditional questions such as amenity, package comparisons, interior finish levels, or unit types and sizes. And then instead of using those traditional questions to determine who our comps are, we instead use those questions to determine how we measure up to those comps. Are we superior or inferior? Why are we superior or inferior? And then if you had to put a price on it, by how much are we superior or inferior? And what this does is it allows our teams to kind of see that they should be priced higher or lower than some of their true comps at times. Because it gets them to think about it a little bit differently. Because of this comp evaluation, the philosophy and the process help them to really understand what their ranking is, and we end up seeing fewer instances where operators' gut reaction is to simply reduce price so that they're the least expensive, or throw out the highest concession to gain market share. They actually are a little bit more thoughtful about the way they think about it because of this front-end process and how we evaluate who our comps are and then kind of where we measure up. In addition to the approach, kind of talking back about uses of comp data, typically it is going to be pricing related. So now you're able to see kind of where you should rank and who your comps are and where do you fall and is your pricing appropriate. But in addition, the approach to evaluating comps has made market surveys a valuable tool for our marketing and sales teams at Alliance as well, where they've held very little weight before. They might consult it just for something very basic, but now, because of the way we look at our comps and identify them and where we rank, we have a much better foundation set for building sales, marketing, and pricing strategy collectively rather than in individual silos. It hammers home the point that the most effective revenue management is a collaboration of sales, marketing, and price, and that really strong sales and marketing efforts are the pillars of healthier pricing. So to clarify, we found that in this process, it fosters a much greater conversation and leads to better understanding of who our customers are specifically. And what I mean by specifically is that people tend to know the demographic segment that they're targeting. So for example, boomers or millennials, they know who they're targeting, but they couldn't necessarily tell you the psychographics, meaning the attitudes like aspirations, lifestyles, or other psychological criteria that their target audiences possess. Having a deeper understanding of our customers that's derived, it actually happens, and it's derived through this comp analysis, and that gives our marketing teams a much better springboard when they're putting together branding strategy or identifying kind of most effective media sources rather than taking a generic approach to marketing where we're just targeting a demographic. So that conversation, without even having to facilitate it, it naturally, we found, has occurred when we start to talk about the traffic that's coming through our door, that, you know, where else are they going, and then where else are they leasing, and then we're able to flesh out true comps, which then typically will give us a trend, or there will be something that kind of screams out what it is that all of our demographic or psychographic customers, kind of those psychographics, what is it that's resonating towards them that we're competing with? So it kind of helps us have a much better idea of more of that granular customer information that we need to do our best marketing. So on the next slide, it does give us a summary, an overarching summary of some of the things we're going to dive into a little deeper in San Diego. Hopefully something I shared today piqued your interest or shifted the way you might think about comp data, and hopefully it piqued your interest enough to make you want to come and see our entire session. But to recap some of the things that we're going to cover in San Diego and that I'll be diving specifically deeper into from an operations perspective are, again, the right comps, who are they, and what are some of the sources and tools we use to identify them, axiometrics, Yardi matrix, things of that nature. How Alliance determines where you fall within your comp set. I'll kind of share a little bit more in depth about how we arrive at that, and even share some examples of some of the tools that we use to show that. And then also talk a little bit more about kind of gaining that more granular insight when you're truly looking at your asset against their true comps as opposed to the submarket. And then, of course, that operations mindset, kind of how it changes when we change the conversation ever so slightly to talk about, you know, who our comps are in reference to how our customers are shopping versus the characteristics we have in common with those next door. So we'll be covering a lot more of that in San Diego, and we certainly hope that you guys will join us.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Really appreciate it. Clark, if you're still on the line, I think you need to give control back to me occasionally, as I think it fades out after a certain amount of time. All right. Thank you so much. There we go. Sorry about that, Rachel. We had some technical difficulties to show your summary slide here, but for the audience here, I'll go ahead and reveal the entire summary here, and I'll wait. Probably about 10 seconds here, so everybody can have some time to read this. And thank you so much for your synopsis. And we really look forward to hearing more about this in San Diego at the Maximize Conference. So next, we're going to have Ian Mattingly, the president of LumaCorp, give his take on this particular question, or these particular questions that we're presenting here today. So we're excited to hear from you, Ian, and thank you very much for attending today.
Thank you, Justin. Appreciate the opportunity. And, you know, one of the reasons I love doing these kinds of panels is, you know, I get to meet people like Rachel and, you know, learn about what some of our competitors are doing out there, you know, with regards to data. And I find that the Maximize Conference is really one of the best investments I make, you know, in our budget every year because of this kind of very actionable information. Give you a little bit of background about myself. You know, I got my start in the industry as a leasing consultant, like so many of us did, and you know, started doing the call-around surveys, you know, back in the, I guess it was the early '90s, and you know, trying to put all that information together. But really, my obsession with data goes back even farther than that. You know, my father, you know, had an economics degree, big tech nerd. You know, we had old school IBM PC, and you know, he would sit there for hours on Lotus 1, 2, 3 trying to figure out ways to make that spreadsheet predict the future. And so, I really grew up in that kind of an environment. We were using data-driven decision-making before DDM really became an acronym. So, yeah, that really informs how we as LumaCorp have operated now for over 30 years, trying to understand our markets, our assets, and our acquisition opportunities using the data that's available. But given that we're a small company, we currently have about 25 assets under management, just over 6,000 units. We have to be really efficient in order to be competitive with the bigger companies out there that operate in the markets that we target for acquisitions. Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and even some of the the tertiary markets, Oklahoma City, where we're starting to see more competition from major groups that have many thousands more units and many more resources and analysts. We don't have teams of analysts crunching data, and we don't have the funds for expensive subscriptions. So we have to be very careful about where we source data, what we're using data, but really, when we talk about using data, we're talking about two different things. We are either benchmarking or forecasting. And so whenever we're looking at trying to identify, comp sets for some kind of an analysis, we start by saying, okay, are we looking backward or are we looking forward? And then we'll go down into kind of the three key elements of any data set, which is the quantity of data points, the quality or accuracy of the data points, and the efficiency of harvesting those data points. And we use many different kinds of comp sets depending on what we're trying to achieve. Everything from, sale comps when we're trying to value our assets ahead of a refinance and trying to forecast proceeds and sources of uses of funds. Rent comps, as Rachel was talking about, when it comes to determining our revenue strategies and trying to value the unique factors that either go along with a planned renovation or in an existing asset. Looking at expense comps when we're looking at underwriting potential acquisitions. We're trying to forecast based on prior experiences, what we're going to be seeing as far as expenses in a particular location, a particular submarket, a particular class of asset. Also when we're in our budgeting process, we're trying to forecast what our experience is going to be over the next 12 months, or if we're doing a 5-year budget, over the next 60 months, what we're going to be seeing on the expense side. And then being in Texas, with all of our assets currently in the state of Texas, we're one of the top 2 or 3 states as far as property tax burdens. So underwriting and forecasting our potential tax exposure on a property by property tax basis is really critical, and that's where comparable data becomes very, very important, because that is often the largest single line item on every single operating statement that we produce. So, we're using data in a lot of different ways, and always we come back to, okay, what are we trying to do? Are we looking forward? Are we looking backward? Are we trying to figure out how we've been doing, whether it's versus the market, internally benchmarking within our portfolio. But again, what is the quantity of data sets available, or quantity of data points available, the quality of the data set, and how efficient is it to harvest those data sets? And it runs the gamut, everything from the call-around surveys that I mentioned earlier, which are extremely inefficient, but we can generate, we think, fairly high-quality data sets in sufficient quantity where we have a concentration of staff to be able to do it, versus purchased data sets like Axiometrics, Yardi Matrix, et cetera, where we can get high quantities, but the quality of those data sets is sometimes suspect because of what Justin mentioned, the fact that they may be quarterly or 3 times a year updates rather than weekly or bi-weekly updates. But it's extremely efficient to harvest them. So we look at what's the time-sensitive nature of the analysis that we're doing. So on pricing, from a pricing standpoint, that's very time-sensitive. We want to be very responsive out there in the marketplace to changes in market trends. But we take a little bit different approach than Rachel in that, we're really much more interested in the overall direction of a market. We're fairly confident that when we get an adequate number of leases to replace move-outs at a stabilized property, that we're priced well. And, we see it again and again. When we push rents beyond that point, leasing falls off. If we've done our job with our marketing plan, we're still getting sufficient traffic, but our capture rates go down. And when we lower rents too much, we get more traffic or more leases than we really need to replace the move-out. So we're constantly looking at that. So the efficiency and the quantity of data points to do that kind of an analysis becomes really critical. Whereas when we're doing forecasting, we are a little bit more flexible about the quality of the data because we typically have more data points to work with. We're looking at a farther periods of time or longer periods of time, and so we can kind of offset the lack of quality of the data points with greater quantity. So there's lots of different ways to use data, and that's one of the reasons I love this industry, and one of the reasons I love what I get to do is, we get to touch all of that. So, I think we're running out of time here pretty quickly, but if you want to advance the slide a little bit, we'll just kind of run through that real quick, and just some of the ways that we use comp data here at LumaCorp, and that pretty much concludes my remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian. Really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to seeing you at Maximize.
Absolutely.
So for everybody else on the call, it gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what we're going to be discussing and the depth of, I think, great information that you're going to be receiving at the conference. So please join us on Tuesday, October 18th at 2:15 to 3:15. There are concurrent sessions during that time. Hopefully you choose to come to this one, as we'll dive even deeper into the different ways that folks are using comp data. And remember that Nyla will also be there, and she wasn't able to present today as well. And so just as an overview of the objectives of the discussion, we're going to identify how to, we're going to talk about how to identify your comps, talk about why comp data is useful, how you ensure apples-to-apples comparisons, talk about the sources of data and the types of information that we're looking at. We're going to get into really, I think, exploratory comp data, things like HR data and salary comps, and how people are using those. And then some of the concerns and how you overcome some of those concerns that I discussed earlier. And then how to evaluate current performance, future performance, acquisition data, development data, all sorts of interesting things around comp data. So on that note, I'm going to pass it back off to Clark to conclude the session today. And thank you everybody for attending, and thank you especially to Ian and Rachel for your contributions today. Hey Clark, are you still there?
Thank you. Thanks everybody for chiming in today. My special thanks go to Justin and Ian and Rachel. This conversation is just a sample of the larger conversation, and this is just one panel among 13 at the event, which will take place October 17 through 19. The Los Coronado Bay is a really awesome and luxurious resort outside of San Diego. It's a great destination. For more information about the other panels and hotel and registration information, you can go to www.naahq.org/maximize. We hope to see you there in San Diego, and thank you all for joining us today.